Hello and welcome back to The World's Last Night. This is James Thayer. It's been quite a while since I last posted, and I'm sorry about that. I sold a house, moved in to another house, tried buying land, didn't work out, tried buying land, didn't work out, tried buying land again, and now we're under contract on a very beautiful piece of property. And so we're still looking at building a house on this property, and at the same time I have regular work, family obligations, and I'm trying to launch a network. So it's just been a lot, and I kind of regret doing the format I've chosen for these recap episodes because it really requires me to go back and reread every chapter of Genesis to sort of pick out what I think is the highlight of that chapter. So next time I do a recap episode of a book in the Bible, I'm probably just going to do things from the top of my head instead of per chapter. But I did go through, I did 15 more chapters, and I kind of wrote down what my highlights were for Genesis chapter 16 through 30. And so that means that there's still several more to go in a subsequent episode. In the meantime, I actually have been reading Exodus. I'm chapter late 20s, early 30s, something like that in Exodus right now. And I've been talking about how much I can't wait to do Exodus. And really, what I should have said is I can't wait to do like the first quarter of Exodus, which is the actual Exodus, because after we get into the desert and Moses is handed the law down from God, there's several subjects that are going to not be fun for me to delve into. So that book's not going to be as fun as I wanted it to be, but definitely the first part of it is pretty fantastic. So I am still excited to get into it for this podcast. So without further ado, here we go, chapter 16 in Genesis. I'm just going to once again run through the highlights. So in chapter 16, we see that Sarah doubts God and tries to bring about the promised child by way of Hagar. So if you remember, this is the promised child that was given to Abraham. He basically said, you're gonna bear a son. Abraham's like, well, I'm really old. I believe you though. Well, time goes by, and as we discussed, when there's a significant time gap between something God has promised and you receiving it, you have the you have the mandate to wait on God, but you're also very tempted to try to bring about God's will on your own. And actually, I can give a great example of this in my personal life here recently, because last December, God told me specifically to build this house. He didn't exactly say build. He gave me a piece of scripture, which we'll go through eventually, but talks about expanding your household because of what God has planned to bring into that. And so I took that to heart, and I'd always wanted to build a home, and I'd been working on it for a year up to that point. And so, God provided for that miraculously. He just kept bringing work my way to my business, which was amazing. But I did get to a point where I was like, I could save up faster for this if I went to a full-time job. And so I actually applied for like 3 different jobs that I am qualified or overqualified for. And I was rejected on one of them, and the other 2 just fizzled out and never heard back from. And I did pray to God. I said, if it's not your will for me to have these, like, don't let me have them. And obviously he didn't. So I was trying to bring about God's provision in my life in my own way. And I really should have just stuck to the program of, God's going to bring this work to my company. I don't need to go and work for someone else at this point in my life. So Sarai at this point, I guess, is sort of doubting God and basically offers Hagar, if you remember, to Abraham to sleep with her servant to bring about this child. Well, Ishmael is born, and that causes a rift because now Sarai's like, I guess I don't know what she expected. I guess she expected Hagar to be barren also, or she just changed her mind there afterwards. But she's jealous, mistreats Hagar. Hagar runs away, but God provides for Hagar. And then, Hagar has Ishmael, who's going to become the father of the Arab peoples. Well, in chapter 17, we see that God's assigning circumcision as a sign of the covenant that he's made with Abraham, because there's like several chapters. It's like 3 or 4 chapters where this covenant sort of unfolds. And so this is just another little side of that. What's this sign going to be? He also renames Sarai Sarah, and all the men in their household are circumcised. And God once again says, Sarah's going to bear a son. And he also says he's going to name him Isaac. Now, Isaac means he laughs. And so there's several times where Sarah kind of like laughs at this notion that in her old age she's going to have a child. So it's sort of ironic. And in a later chapter, we're going to talk more about that. Or we did talk more about that. But all right, chapter 18, there's these 3 mysterious men that show up to Abraham's place. And if you remember, one of them is the angel of the Lord. And we talked about the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is most likely a Christophany, which is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. And so the angel of the Lord actually takes Abraham aside and speaks to him. And if you remember, the other 2 angels, well, they head down to Sodom. And so the one, he blesses Abraham. He says, they've come to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and basically says, and I quote, their sin is very grave. So Abraham tries to intercede for Sodom. And if you remember, he does this like bargaining with God. He's like, if there are 100 righteous people in that city, like, will you spare it? And God's like, well, yeah, for 100 righteous people, I would. And he kind of goes down and down and down. And he finally says, well, if there's 10 in the city, would you spare it? And the Lord answers, yes. And I think something I did not talk about is sort of what that really says about the state of Sodom at that point. That there's really not even 10 righteous people, 10 people that follow God living in that city. And, we're going to get into Exodus and eventually Joshua. Joshua is one of my favorite books. But Joshua's like, I like it because of all the war. I know, I'm sorry. I think it's really interesting, though. And so Joshua really leads the Israelite people to war against all those settled in Canaan, whom God has waited 400 years to repent, and they don't. It really goes to show that there's probably not even 10 righteous people in those cities that the Israelites push out violently when we get to that point. God is merciful. He's really into sparing people. But Sodom is apparently like just beyond redemption. So, but he does say, yeah, if there were 10 righteous people, I would spare it. So chapter 19, sort of, I would say on account of Abraham, God rescues Lot and his household. If you remember, those 2 angels show up. The men of the town all gather around. They want to rape the angels. Lot's like, no. And remember, Lot is Abraham's nephew. Lot's like, no, don't do this evil thing. Like, why would you do this evil thing? And then he turns around and suggests an alternative evil thing to do with his daughters. And he's like, here, take my daughters. Do what you want to them. Which is like just as evil. So, we talked about Lot. We did a lot. I think it's a great chapter that we talked about. It's chapter 19. We had to talk about all the like sexual deviancies and sort of God's plan for sex in that chapter, if you remember. But the angels, they blind everyone. They bring Lot into the house, and basically Lot escapes. And so the angels are like, go to the mountains. Lot's like, I can't do that. I'm too old. Let me go to this little small town. And the angels are like, oh, fine. Like, this is, God really like does put up with us, like in our preferences for some reason. He's so merciful. But the angels basically said, don't turn around. And yet Lot's wife, what does she do? She turns around, she looks at the city, she dies for it. The Bible says she turns into a pillar of salt. Interestingly enough, Sodom is supposedly around where the Dead Sea is, which has tons of salt. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I haven't really figured it out yet, the why. But in any case, why salt? I'm sorry. Why a pillar of salt? But in any case, the why as to what theologians believe caused her to sin is that she actually lamented and grieved for this city, or that she wanted to go back, or basically her heart was not in obedience to God and what God, and God, the angels who aren't God, but the angels are ministers of God, they explicitly told her, don't look back, and she disobeyed. So there's that. And you're going to find actually that God is really big on obedience, especially when we get into Exodus, when we get into Leviticus. He's really big on obedience. His mercy is fascinating, honestly, in light of how holy he is and desirous of obedience, and how we are always teetering on the edge of destruction because of our sin, and yet he holds back. Well, in this case, he didn't. He rightfully took Lot's wife's life because she disobeyed, because he gave it to her. Anyways, we talked about this. But then Lot's daughters, if you remember, they get him drunk, and they sleep with him, and each bears a son. And so one of the son is going to be the father of the Moabites, and the other is going to be the father of the Ammonites. Now remember, the Ammonites are sort of the people group officially named as that are going to be dwelling in the promised land. They live in Canaan. Both of these people are going to be enemies of Israel down the line. So, chapter 20, Abraham and his family travels towards the Negev. And I was reading another translation that called it Negeb with a B, which is interesting because, like, in Spanish, for example, I believe the V sounds like a B. Anyways, it just was interesting to me. But, okay, so they travel to the Negev, and on the way, Abraham does the same thing again in Egypt that he did in Egypt, but instead he does it to Abimelech. You remember Abimelech? We talked about him. He was a ruler, and we're not quite sure if that's his name or if that's just a title like Pharaoh, but I kind of lean towards a title. Like Abimelech means ruler, king. It's not necessarily the name of the king at that time, because there's another Abimelech later that would have to be that Abimelech's son. In any case, you remember Abraham really screwed up in Egypt. He's like, yeah, this is my sister. And, sins, talking about his wife because of his cowardice. Well, he does the same thing to Abimelech. And then Abimelech takes to her, right? But God warns Abimelech in a dream and says, she's married. And Abimelech is like outraged at this because God threatens to kill Abimelech. Also closes up the wombs of his whole household. Like all the women in his family can't bear children. Abraham gives a really dumb excuse, and then Abimelech sends him away, but gives him all kinds of gifts on the way out. You kind of do that to someone who's like, well, God also said, have Abraham pray for you for healing to Abimelech. But it's like, here, take these gifts. Please get out of my land. Like, you're nothing but trouble. And Abraham kind of does this frequently, I feel like. And his son will do it too, if you remember. But, Abraham prays for Abimelech, and his whole household's healed, and they're able to bear children again. So chapter 21, we see Isaac is finally born. And it was decades this family was waiting on Isaac. But God has perfect timing. And so, Sarah, after Isaac is born, she says, and I quote, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. She says, and who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So Sarah was barren, and then Sarah was also extremely old. So the odds of her having a child were very, very slim. Yet, but God. There's a lot of but God statements in the Bible. But God intervened, and God gave her a child. And the funny thing is, the child's name is He Laughs, and here she's still laughing, and she's saying that basically, like, God is making fun of me. God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. It's kind of preposterous that she would have this child. Like, what a fun story to tell all your friends. But in any case, God has a sense of humor, and we'll find that out more and more in the Bible. There are occasions where you find out that God has a sense of humor. And sometimes, between you and me, it's a dark sense of humor. But here we go. Chapter 22. God calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And we find out that Isaac, in this instance, is a type for Christ. He carries the wood up the mountain. And Christ carried his cross. There's several different comparisons here. And Abraham's faith is being tested. And we talked about the Hebrews reference, about how Abraham believed that, at this point had so much faith in God that if God called him to sacrifice his one and only son, that God would then raise that son from the dead. Why? Because God had already promised Abraham that this son would be the child of promise, that his legacy would run through. And so, hey, what else? What other solution do you have? If he dies and God made that promise and God can't lie, God's going to raise him from the dead. So the Hebrews writer basically believed that Abraham just had faith that he would get Isaac back, even if he had to go through with this. So that's extreme faith. So anyways, God basically says, you've not withheld your son, your one and only son, from me. And that's pretty amazing. That's extreme obedience, extreme love. And as we find, that's the heart that God has also when he gives his one and only son for us. Now, ask me to give up my daughter for someone else. No, it's just not going to happen. I'll give myself up, maybe, depending. I don't want to say something I've never actually had to face and decide before. But that kind of love, bottom line, is very extreme, especially how God gave up Christ to die for sinners, evil people like me, not like righteous, good people that follow him, but his enemies. So that's something to think about intently, about the love that it took to procure our salvation. So in chapter 23, Sarah dies, and Abraham buys a burial field / cave called Machpelah in Hebron. And as we find out later down the line, Abraham's buried here, and all the patriarchs are buried here. You got Jacob and Isaac and some of the wives, I guess like Rebecca and Rachel. Don't hold me to that. I believe they are, though. But then chapter 24, we get an often overlooked character. Like, I feel like preachers really need to preach entire sermons on this character, but you have this servant of Abraham who was sent to fetch a wife for Isaac, and this guy is on a mission. He isn't distracted. We sort of talked about he's one of the better characters in the Old Testament. He's completely sold out to his master Abraham, fully loyal to him. It's a great example for us how we should be towards our master Jesus Christ, right? And so this servant finds Rebecca. And unfortunately, Rebecca has a somewhat scheming older brother named Laban. And you and I, we talked about Laban a lot, and we were really happy when he was out of the picture. But he always takes advantage of situations. He's sort of just like he's shrewd. He's a schemer. And in the end of this chapter, Rebecca and Isaac marry each other, and it says Isaac loved her. So they love each other, and they have this great marriage. Sort of. Chapter 25. I'm sorry. Chapter 20. I'm sorry. I've been saying Isaac. Oh, okay. Here we go. Chapter 25. Jacob and Esau are born. So Esau is born first, but remember, he sells his birthright to Jacob for a meal. He profanes it. He holds it cheap. And in chapter 26, we find that Isaac commits the same sin his dad did in regards to Abimelech, whoever the current Abimelech is anyways. And he tries to pass off his wife, Rebecca, apparently didn't love her enough, right, as his sister. And there's all that bad drama. But God provides for Isaac through a famine, and likewise provides him a well when his other wells are taken by those living in Gerar near him. So chapter 27, we have Jacob stealing Esau's blessing through the trickery of his mom's plan. So Rebecca comes up with this plan. Rebecca loves Jacob more. Isaac loves Esau more. God had already prophesied that Jacob would be the head and not Esau between these brothers. In any case, Jacob steals a blessing, pretends to be Esau, gets the blessing. Isaac is trembling because he knows God has allowed him to be outplayed, right? And Jacob flees from Esau because Esau wants to kill him. Remember, Rebecca said, go to your family, go to Laban, and run for your life until Esau's anger dies, and I'll come get you, which, as you and I both know, it never happens. She never sends for him. So chapter 28, Jacob heads back to Laban, right? But he stopped. This is a great chapter. But he stops at a place he'd later call Bethel or Bethel, which I believe is house of God. I forget. El is definitely the Lord. But okay, he has a dream where God comes to him and tells him about the promise handed down to him from his father and grandfather. So he dreams about a stairway where angels ascend and descend. And you and I talked about how Jesus references this verse. He calls himself the stairway. Right? So he is the access point to heaven. And Jacob, he only gets to dream about this. The patriarchs only dream about Jesus. They don't actually get to see him. And yet you and I have access to heaven through Christ from this. So in chapter 29, Jacob has like that whole ordeal where he works to marry Rachel, but he's hoodwinked by Laban, right? And he has to marry Leah. And then he works for Rachel too, which makes a disastrous family unit, but God eventually redeems it. There was a story I wanted to tell you. Okay. What was this? We're only 20 minutes in. Let me tell you a story first before I go back to verse 29. So here's my story, going back to verse 28, talking about Bethel and Bethel. When I first became a Christian, the thing that really sold the faith to me was the fact that my mom took me to a night of a man who was establishing a church in Middle Tennessee, and this man had the gift of prophecy. And so when I went to this night, he basically, asked for people to come up. I came up, and he prayed over, several of us. It was a really small meeting. He prayed over us. And I honestly, at this point in my life, I don't believe I ever experienced the presence of God. And so he was praying over me, touched my forehead, and I basically almost passed out. What it really was is I kind of like went to a sleep, some sort of trance. I was young. It was definitely peaceful, like warm, like wonderful feeling. And I laid down actually, and like people kind of like laid me down on the ground. You've seen kind of this, it's weird. I know if you never experienced it, it's weird, but I'm just telling you kind of a little bit of my testimony. That was the first place I ever really met God. And he gave me visions, and this man prophesied over my life and told me kind of what the spirit that God had placed in me and the mission that I was to do. But one of the things that recently popped in my mind, because that was about 18 years ago, I went back and revisited that church one Sunday morning here recently, and the church had changed names, and that man wasn't there anymore, but it was sort of like what had been passed down from what he established. New head pastors or whatever. And I really felt the presence of God. And between you and me, I don't usually cry, but like I kind of wept profusely at this service. And I just I was thinking a couple things. One, this overwhelming, what's the word I'm looking for? Just a flood of emotion in regards to all that God had done for me. And I was thinking about when he saved me and drew me out of depression and filled me with joy and what he saved me from. And then I thought about all the sin in my life and all that he saved me from. And then I just sort of thought about Jesus crawling up on a cross for me. And yeah, I cried a lot. But then the last thing that I thought about was that the place I was standing in was sort of my Bethel. It was the first place I ever experienced the presence of God. And you remember Jacob in this chapter 28, his head pops off the rock and he's like, oh my gosh, I experienced God. God is in this place. I was just reminded that, 18-ish years ago, 19 years ago, like God met me in that place. And it's not that the place necessarily, and it's not the only place you feel the presence of God. Like pop into many of the churches around where I live, and in every worship service, you're going to feel the presence of God. But it was just a sort of reminder that like God is actually very interested in you, in your personal day-to-day life. And the God of the universe who created the cosmos, who created planets, thousands of times larger than ours, like we are insignificant in the grand scheme of things, cares about you so much and loves you so much that he will meet you in a place, and he will flood that place with his presence. And I was just reminded of that, which made me cry even more, that 18 years ago, God met me. And he may have known that I needed that experience to actually be sold on things, because that experience, I was bought in, and I've never been able to be reasoned out or bought out or emotioned out or whatever. So I just wanted to sort of add that little story that, because Jacob goes back to that place again, that there might be points in your past where you remember the presence of God being very thick, and you want to experience that again. Well, you can, go back to it. God's always wanting to pour more of himself into you. And I think oftentimes it's just we don't think to ask him to and really dwell and meditate on all that he's done for us. So, okay, that was a tangent, but I thought it'd be good to sneak in there. All right, chapter 29, Jacob, all right, we worked for Rachel, got hoodwinked into Leah. Worked again for Rachel, married Rachel, now I got polygamy. Terrible family structure. Marrying two sisters. We talked about this. I don't need to harp on it. It's disastrous, right? But God redeems it. And out of these marriages, out of this family, dysfunctional family, we get the 12 sons of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they have dysfunction. I mean, it's hard to grow up in that family and not have issues. And we're going to talk about them in the later recaps. We've already talked about them in depth. But in any case, chapter 30, Jacob, after toiling forever under Laban, who's been unjust to him, changing his wages, oh my gosh, he had the best worker in the world and he mistreated him. Jacob finally finds prosperity, though, right? And he gets enough prosperity that he can leave Laban with his family. And yeah, like I said, he has many children. They're going to be the fathers of the Israelite tribes. And that's the end of chapter 30. So when I come back, I'm going to see if I can do the next 20 chapters. We'll see. It takes a long time to read through it and hit the highlights. But I also want to do a good job. But I promise you, whenever we get back to Exodus, things will be a lot smoother. When we start the next one, we'll get back to hopefully doing it daily. And I'm going to try really hard to knock out the next episode tomorrow. But until then, this is James from The World's Last Night.